September 21st, 1943. Rechlin Experimental Airfield, Germany. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete as Flugkapitän Hans-Werner Lerche walked slowly around the newly arrived Boeing B-17G flying fortress, his practiced eye-absorbing details that would have meant nothing to most observers but spoke volumes to a test pilot of his experience. The bomber bore German markings now, black crosses on the wings, a swastika on the tail, but everything else about it screamed American industrial power. What stopped Lerche mid-stride, what made him pause and count again to be certain his eyes weren't deceiving him, were the gun positions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He counted once, then twice, then a third time, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. 13 heavy machine guns of 50 caliber on a single aircraft. The number seemed impossible. Lerche had flown the captured B-17F model designated Wolfhound earlier that year. That aircraft had carried 9 guns, an armament that had already impressed German evaluators as excessive, wasteful even, typical of American philosophy, that threw resources at problems rather than solving them elegantly. But 9 guns at least made sense within German understanding of defensive armament. 13 defied every principle of aircraft design that Lerche had learned in his engineering studies and years of test flying. The weight alone, he calculated quickly in his head, must exceed half a ton just for the weapons, without accounting for ammunition, mounting hardware, or the power turrets that moved several of the guns through their fields of fire. No nation could afford to put such armament on bombers produced in quantity. The resource expenditure would be staggering, unless, and here the thought that would haunt German military planners took shape, unless American industrial capacity was so vast that such expenditure meant nothing to them. If the Americans could afford to equip their bombers with Cot-Alive, 13 heavy machine guns as standard equipment, what else could they afford that Germany could not? The transformation from the B-17F to the G model had occurred in response to a specific tactical problem, one that German fighter pilots had discovered and exploited with devastating effectiveness throughout 1943. The early Flying Fortress variants carried their heaviest defensive armament facing rearward and to the sides, with relatively light forward-facing guns operated by the bombardier and navigator, who had other primary duties during combat and were not dedicated gunners. German fighter ace, Hauptmann Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II, had pioneered frontal attack tactics in late 1942, recognizing that approaching bombers head-on minimized exposure time to defensive fire while targeting the aircraft's weakest defensive zone. The tactic worked spectacularly when executed properly. A fighter diving from 12 o'clock high, approaching from above and directly ahead, faced only 2 or 3 manually aimed machine guns in the bomber's plexiglass nose. The combined closing speed of fighter and bomber exceeded 500 miles per hour, with the attacking fighter approaching at 350 to 400 miles per hour, while the bomber flew toward it at 150 to 180 miles per hour. This gave the bomber's nose gunner perhaps 2 seconds to aim and fire before the fighter flashed past overhead or underneath, 2 seconds during which he had to track a rapidly approaching target, estimate lead angle, and fire accurately despite wind blast, vibration, and the psychological pressure of watching a fighter dive directly toward him with guns blazing. The attacking pilot, meanwhile, enjoyed a nearly stationary target growing larger in his gun sight, making aim calculation relatively simple compared to deflection shots against crossing targets. German pilots who mastered the head-on pass achieved impressive kill ratios, sometimes downing multiple bombers in a single mission. But the attack demanded exceptional nerve and discipline. Fighter and bomber hurtled toward each other at combined speeds where the distance between them closed at nearly 750 feet per second. The attacking pilot needed to hold his course directly into the bomber's nose, watching it grow from a distant speck to a massive 4-engine aircraft filling his windscreen, waiting until the range closed to point-blank distance of 200 yards or less before firing his cannons and machine guns. Any hesitation, any early breakaway prompted by survival instinct, reduced effectiveness dramatically by wasting the limited ammunition carried by German fighters. Even successful frontal attacks often proved fatal for the German pilot despite destroying the bomber. The combined closing speed meant collision remained a constant danger that required precise timing and spatial judgment. Pilots who pressed their attacks too aggressively, fixating on their target and forgetting to break away in time, sometimes couldn't pull out before their fighter struck the bomber they were attacking. Multiple Luftwaffe fighters collided with B-17s during frontal passes, killing both crews instantly in the violent impact. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, American bomber crews reported increasing numbers of frontal attacks and casualty rates. Among bombardiers and navigators stationed in the exposed nose positions climbed steadily. The plexiglass nose glazing provided excellent visibility for accurate bombing through the Norden bombsight, but offered no protection against 20mm cannon shells and 13mm machine gun bullets that German fighters fired from point-blank range. Boeing engineers and 8th Air Force commanders understood that the frontal attack vulnerability represented a critical weakness that German pilots were learning to exploit more effectively with each mission. The solution they developed would fundamentally alter the bomber's defensive capability and force German fighter tactics to evolve once again. The B-17G model introduced the Bendix chin turret, a remotely operated turret mounting two 50-caliber machine guns that protruded from beneath the bombardier's position in the nose. This powered turret, controlled by the bombardier through a computing gun sight, could track targets approaching from directly ahead throughout their entire approach from first detection at long range to the moment they flashed past the aircraft. The addition seemed simple enough, just two more guns in a new position, but the tactical implications proved enormous for both American bomber crews and German fighter pilots. Combined with the existing cheek guns operated by the bombardier and navigator through flexible mounts in the nose glazing, plus the top turret which could swing forward to add its two guns to the defensive barrage, a B-17G could now bring 6 to 8 heavy machine guns to bear on a frontal attacker, creating a defensive cone of fire that required exceptional skill to penetrate without taking fatal damage. The head-on attack that had been the preferred tactic of German aces throughout early and mid-1943 suddenly became far more dangerous, forcing the Luftwaffe to search for new tactical solutions to an evolving defensive problem. But the chin turret represented only one element of a comprehensive defensive upgrade that transformed the B-17 into what German test pilots would describe as the most heavily defended bomber they had ever encountered. The G model incorporated improvements throughout the entire defensive system based on 2 years of brutal combat experience over Europe. The tail position, always the most important defensive station on any bomber, received upgraded ammunition capacity, with 500 rounds per gun for the twin 50-caliber machine, guns mounted in the Cheyenne tail turret. This enclosed position, with excellent visibility through clear plexiglass panels, commanded a clear field of fire directly aft, with no blind spots above, below, or to either side within 30 degrees of the tail axis. The dorsal turret, a Sperry design mounting two 50-caliber guns in a powered rotating turret positioned just aft of the cockpit, could engage targets anywhere above the horizontal plane, swinging through 360 degrees of azimuth and nearly 90 degrees of elevation. The ball turret, called the Sperry ball turret by Americans, provided complete coverage of the lower hemisphere with no blind spots. This remarkable piece of engineering positioned a gunner in a rotating sphere equipped with two 50-caliber machine guns and a computing gun sight that helped calculate the lead angle needed to hit fast-moving targets at deflection angles. The waist positions, staggered along the fuselage to prevent gunners from interfering with each other's movement, each mounted a 50-caliber machine gun on a flexible ring that allowed wide traverse in azimuth and elevation. These gunners stood at open windows where they endured temperatures far below zero at altitude, hurricane-force winds from the open windows, and constant engine noise that made communication difficult, but their positions covered the critical beam angles where German fighters often attacked. When Lerche climbed into the captured B-17G's cockpit for his first examination of the aircraft's systems, he brought with him extensive experience evaluating captured Allied aircraft. He had flown over 125 different aircraft types during the war, without a single serious crash or damage incident, a remarkable safety record that testified to both technical skill and careful methodology in approaching unfamiliar aircraft. His engineering background from university studies, combined with exceptional natural flying ability, developed through years of glider flying and powered aircraft experience, made him ideally suited for the demanding and dangerous work of test flying enemy aircraft. With no instruction manual, no training program, no checklist, no qualified instructor to provide guidance. But even with all this experience, the B-17G impressed him in ways that earlier American bombers had not. The sheer weight of defensive armament, when he calculated it precisely, exceeded 700 pounds for the guns alone. Add the ammunition load of approximately 11,000 rounds distributed across all 13 gun positions, according to a carefully calculated scheme that balanced defensive coverage with weight considerations, and the defensive system's total weight approached 4,000 pounds, nearly 2 tons, devoted entirely to shooting back at attackers. German bomber designs allocated perhaps 1/5 that weight to defensive armament. The Heinkel He 111, the Luftwaffe's standard medium bomber throughout most of the war, typically carried 6 or 7 machine guns of mixed caliber, many of them rifle-caliber 7.92mm weapons, with limited effectiveness against attacking fighters at combat ranges. The Junkers Ju-88 fast bomber might have 4 or 5 defensive positions scattered around the airframe, each with limited fields of fire and inadequate ammunition supplies for sustained engagement. Even the Heinkel He 177, Germany's only operational 4-engine heavy bomber, carried defensive armament that paled in comparison to the Flying Fortress. Total defensive firepower rarely exceeded 6 guns, often of lighter caliber than the 50 caliber weapons that equipped every position on the B-17. And the He 177 suffered from chronic engine fires due to its unusual coupled engine design, mechanical problems that limited operational availability so severely that many units refused to accept the type, preferring twin-engine medium bombers despite their inferior range and bomb load. The 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun that equipped every defensive position on the B-17G represented mature weapons technology, refined through decades of development and manufactured with precision that German armament factories could not match despite having more advanced machine tool industries at the war's start. Each gun fired standard 50 caliber BMG ammunition at 750 to 800 rounds per minute, with the weapons capable of maintaining sustained fire for several minutes at a time, limited only by ammunition capacity and barrel heat buildup that required careful management by gunners to prevent weapon damage. The 50 caliber BMG cartridge delivered 3 times the kinetic energy of German 7.92mm rounds and comparable energy to German 13mm heavy machine guns, but with longer effective range and better armor penetration characteristics. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds that made up a significant portion of the ammunition load could penetrate armor plate, destroy engines, shatter canopies, and kill pilots from ranges exceeding 600 yards, ranges where German rifle-caliber defensive guns were nearly useless. When Lerche and other test pilots at Rechlin conducted firing tests to understand the B-17G's defensive capabilities from the attacker's perspective, the perspective that mattered most to German fighter pilots who would face these bombers in combat, the results proved sobering for Luftwaffe tactical planners who understood the implications. German fighter pilots climbed into Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 4 190s, then made simulated attack runs on the captured fortress while it flew straight and level or performed evasive maneuvers. Ground observers photographed the engagements and recorded angles, ranges, closure rates, and exposure times. Combat cameramen filmed the exercises from chase planes, creating training footage that could be shown to fighter squadrons across Germany and occupied Europe. These exercises revealed uncomfortable truths that contradicted pre-war assumptions about bomber vulnerability and confirmed that the B-17G represented a significant evolution beyond earlier models. Attacking from directly behind, the traditional German approach to bomber interception that had worked well against earlier Allied bombers with limited defensive armament, now exposed the fighter pilot to concentrated fire from at least 4 heavy machine guns. The tail gunner alone could bring 2 guns to bear with excellent visibility and a powered turret that tracked smoothly through its entire range of motion. The dorsal turret could swing rearward to add its firepower to the defensive barrage, doubling the number of guns engaging a rear attacker. Even the waist gunners standing at open windows along the fuselage midsection could engage targets approaching from behind and slightly below or to the sides, adding their fire to the defensive cone. The closing speed between attacking fighter and fleeing bomber, typically around 150 to 200 miles per hour differential, gave the German pilot perhaps 3 to 5 seconds of firing time before breaking away to avoid collision with the massive bomber. During those few seconds, the bomber's gunners poured hundreds of rounds into the approach corridor, creating a cone of fire that the fighter had to penetrate. At typical combat ranges of 400 to 800 yards, 1 in every 4 or 5 rounds loaded in American machine gun belts was a tracer, creating visible streams of fire that seemed to fill the sky around attacking fighters. These tracers, while intended primarily to help gunners adjust their aim by showing bullet trajectory, also provided an immense psychological deterrent to attacking pilots. German pilots saw walls of fire converging on their aircraft from multiple bombers simultaneously, and instinctively broke off attacks before reaching optimal firing position. Attacking from below presented different challenges, but no better prospects for the attacking fighter. The ball turret provided complete coverage of the lower hemisphere with no blind spots. The gunner, crouched in impossibly cramped quarters with knees drawn up to his chest and oxygen mask pressed against the optical sight, could track targets through 360 degrees of azimuth and nearly 90 degrees of elevation from horizontal to nearly straight down. The physical demands were severe, as the position was too small for a parachute, too cramped for much movement, and required the gunner to remain curled in a fetal position for hours during long missions that could stretch to 8 or 9 hours from takeoff to landing. But the defensive capability was unmatched by any other bomber in service with any air force. No angle of approach from below escaped the ball turret's field of fire. German pilots quickly learned through bitter experience that attacking from beneath a B-17 formation meant exposing themselves to concentrated fire from multiple ball turrets, each one tracking their approach with mechanical precision and opening fire at maximum effective range of 600 yards or more, depending on atmospheric conditions and target aspect. Side attacks faced the waist gunners positioned in open windows along the fuselage, plus the dorsal turret, which could rotate to engage targets anywhere above the horizontal plane, and potentially the ball turret, if the attacking fighter's flight path brought it within the lower turret's field of fire. The interlocking fields of fire created zones where multiple guns could engage a single target simultaneously, concentrating fire in a way that dramatically increased hit probability, even though individual gunner accuracy remained relatively low due to the difficulties of deflection, shooting at high closing speeds and long ranges. This concentrated firepower forced German fighters to make high-speed slashing attacks rather than sustained gun runs, limiting their time on target and reducing accuracy of their own fire, while increasing their exposure to defensive guns from multiple bombers in the formation. The tactic that had emerged from earlier testing of captured B-17F models as offering the best chance of success, frontal attacks approaching the bomber head-on from 12 o'clock high, had been effectively countered by the chin turret installation on the G model. What had been the bomber's weakest defensive zone, protected only by 2 or 3 flexible guns in the nose operated by crew members with other primary duties, was now defended by 6 to 8 heavy machine guns that could concentrate fire along the approach corridor with devastating effect. A German fighter pilot, boring in from directly ahead, now faced not just the psychological pressure of watching a massive bomber grow larger in his windscreen while holding course into its defensive fire, but also the mathematical reality that 6 to 8 guns firing 750 rounds per minute each could throw approximately 75 to 100 heavy machine gun bullets into the approach corridor every second of his attack run. The numbers, when German test pilots and tactical analysts calculated them precisely using data gathered from the simulated attack exercises at Rechlin, suggested that frontal attacks on B-17G formations would result in drastically higher fighter losses than the same attacks against earlier models. And frontal attacks had already been dangerous enough against F models that many pilots lacked the nerve to press them home effectively, breaking away too early and wasting their limited ammunition without inflicting serious damage on the target bomber. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Consider the arithmetic that German fighter pilots faced when attacking B-17G formations, arithmetic that explained why experienced Luftwaffe officers who understood the numbers began to privately express doubts about Germany's ability to stop the daylight bombing campaign. A single B-17G carried 13 Browning M2 machine guns of 50 caliber, positioned to provide complete defensive coverage, with no blind spots and minimal gaps in coverage. These weapons fired at 750 to 800 rounds per minute, with each gun capable of maintaining sustained fire, limited only by ammunition capacity that provided each position with hundreds of rounds available for defensive engagement. The typical ammunition load for a B-17G totaled approximately 11,000 rounds distributed across all gun positions. The tail turret carried 500 rounds per gun for 1,000 rounds total, sufficient for sustained engagement of pursuing fighters throughout the mission. The dorsal turret held similar quantities to allow the top turret gunner to engage multiple targets over an extended period. The ball turret, despite severe space constraints in the cramped sphere, carried 250 to 500 rounds per gun depending on mission requirements and the gunner's size, as larger gunners required more space, leaving less room for ammunition storage. The waist positions each had 600 to 800 rounds for their flexible guns. The chin turret carried approximately 400 rounds per gun. The cheek guns in the nose held similar loads calculated to provide adequate ammunition for the entire mission without excessive weight penalty. When German test pilots at Rechlin calculated the combined firepower of a single B-17G firing all guns simultaneously at a target, the numbers proved staggering and explained why bomber crews expressed such confidence in their defensive capabilities, despite facing determined German fighter opposition on every mission deep into Germany. 13 guns at 750 rounds per minute each produced a combined rate of fire approaching 10,000 rounds per minute across all positions. Translated to rounds per second to better understand the immediate tactical effect that attacking pilots would experience, a fully engaged fortress could throw approximately 160 heavy machine gun bullets into the surrounding airspace every second, creating a cone of fire that filled the approach corridor with lethal projectiles traveling at supersonic velocity. But American bombers never flew alone over enemy territory. The entire concept of American daylight strategic bombing, developed through pre-war doctrine and refined through painful combat experience in 1942 and 1943, relied on massed formations where multiple bombers provided mutual defensive fire that dramatically increased the firepower any single attacking fighter would face. The combat box formation, developed by Colonel Curtis LeMay and refined through bloody experience over Germany, positioned bombers in tight three-dimensional arrays, where each aircraft's guns could support its neighbors, creating overlapping fields of fire that left few gaps for attacking fighters to exploit. A typical three-squadron group box contained 18 to 27 aircraft, depending on attrition and maintenance status. If each bomber carried 13 guns, as the B-17G models did, the group's combined defensive armament exceeded 230 to 350 heavy machine guns, providing interlocking fire across the entire formation. 3 such groups combined to form a wing box with 54 to 81 bombers and 700 to over 1,000 machine guns, providing defensive fire that created zones where attacking fighters faced concentrated fire from dozens of bombers simultaneously. The psychological impact of facing such firepower overwhelmed many German pilots, regardless of actual hit probability, which remained relatively low due to the difficulties of deflection shooting, range estimation, and the brief time available for engagement before the high closing speeds carried fighters past their targets. Luftwaffe after-action reports documented numerous instances of fighters breaking off attacks prematurely, before reaching optimal firing range, because pilots couldn't force themselves to fly deeper into the defensive barrage that seemed to fill the sky with tracers, creating visible streams of fire from dozens of guns. Those pilots who maintained formation discipline and pressed attacks home, despite the defensive fire, faced brutal arithmetic that favored the defenders. Luftwaffe studies conducted using data from actual combat engagements determined that rear attacks on B-17s required an average of 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells to destroy a bomber, and that figure assumed hits were distributed across vulnerable systems rather than concentrated in one area where redundancy might allow the aircraft to continue functioning. The B-17's rugged construction, redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor protection for critical crew positions and components allowed it to absorb tremendous punishment and continue flying, often returning to England with damage that seemed unsurvivable. Average pilot accuracy against evasive targets at combat ranges ran approximately 2%, a figure determined through analysis of gun camera footage and ammunition expenditure reports from frontline fighter units across all theaters. Therefore, bringing down a single fortress from behind required firing approximately 1,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition to achieve the 20 hits needed for a kill, assuming average pilot marksmanship under combat conditions with high closing speeds, target evasion, and the stress of flying through defensive fire from multiple bombers. Early model Focke-Wulf 100, 90 fighters carried only 500 rounds, total of 20mm ammunition distributed across 2 cannons, with each gun holding 250 rounds in drum magazines that limited sustained fire and required careful ammunition management. Upgrading to 4 cannons with belt-fed ammunition in later variants provided only 500 to 600 total rounds across all guns, still insufficient for multiple attack runs against the bombers when accounting for ammunition expenditure rates needed to achieve lethal hit density. Even with upgraded armament, a German fighter pilot might have ammunition for 1, perhaps 2 sustained gun runs before running Winchester, in American pilot terminology, and being forced to break off and return to base for rearming. Meanwhile, the bombers continued firing as long as they detected threats, their thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition allowing prolonged defensive engagement throughout the mission from the moment fighters appeared on the horizon until the bombers crossed back over friendly territory or fighter escorts, drove away the attackers. While individual bomber gunners achieved relatively low hit percentages due to difficult deflection shooting at extreme ranges and high closure speeds that complicated lead angle calculations, the sheer volume of fire made hits statistically inevitable when dozens of bombers engaged a single target. If each bomber achieved only 1 or 2% hit probability, typical for aerial gunnery under combat conditions, a formation of 20 bombers, concentrating fire on a single fighter, created a combined hit probability of 20 to 40% per engagement. Unacceptable odds for pilots who needed to survive dozens or hundreds of combat missions to achieve ace status or simply complete their combat tours alive. Luftwaffe fighter losses climbed steadily through 1943 as American bomber streams grew larger and more frequent, while German fighter forces struggled to regenerate losses faster than combat attrition and training accidents destroyed them. Frontal attacks offered better kill ratios for skilled pilots with strong nerves and steady aim, but demanded extraordinary courage and precise execution that not all pilots possessed, particularly the young replacement pilots arriving at frontline units with minimal training, as the war dragged on and Germany's pilot training program deteriorated under fuel shortages and instructor casualties. Approaching head-on meant the fighter closed at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, with both aircraft moving toward each other at maximum speed. At that closure rate, the target picture changed dramatically every second, requiring constant attention and rapid decision-making from pilots who often had fewer than 100 hours of total flight time and minimal combat experience. Range estimation became critical to attack success, as opening fire too early meant rounds dissipated without effect, while waiting too long made collision unavoidable, a fate that befell numerous German pilots who became fixated on their target and forgot to break away in time. The optimal firing envelope lasted perhaps 2 seconds from 400 yards to 100 yards, a brief window requiring precise timing and exceptional reflexes that only experienced pilots developed through repeated combat missions. During those 2 seconds, The fighter pilot needed to aim carefully while compensating for his own aircraft's motion, compensate for the bomber's evasive maneuvers, which might include slight turns or altitude changes that threw off aim, fire multiple bursts while correcting aim between bursts based on observed tracer impact, and initiate the breakaway maneuver before the aircraft collided in a fireball that would kill both crews instantly. The first B-17G models arrived in England during September 1943, assigned to the 91st Bombardment Group, stationed at Bassingbourn, Cambridgeshire. The timing proved significant, as the 8th Air Force was preparing for a renewed offensive deep into Germany targeting critical industries that supported the German war machine. The missions planned for October 1943 would test the new model's defensive improvements under the most demanding combat conditions, attacking targets deep in Germany, where Luftwaffe fighter response would be strongest and most determined. October 14, 1943, a date that would become known as Black Thursday in 8th Air Force history, saw the second mission against the Messerschmitt factory complex at Regensburg and ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. 291 B-17s from multiple bombardment groups departed English airfields that morning, including both older F models and the newest G variants just entering service. The mission plan called for penetration deep into southern Germany, over 300 miles beyond the range where escort fighters could provide protection, leaving the bombers to fight their way to the target and back, using only their defensive armament. German fighter controllers had learned from the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission in August to wait until American escort fighters departed before launching their attacks, conserving their forces and fuel for the period when bombers flew unprotected through hostile airspace. As the B-17 formations crossed into Germany, Luftwaffe fighters from multiple Jagdgeschwader began assembling for coordinated attacks that would continue throughout the bomber stream's penetration to the target and fighting withdrawal back toward England. The bomber crews in the new G models quickly discovered that 13 guns provided far better defensive coverage than 9, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability of any bomber flying without fighter escort through airspace swarming with enemy fighters. German pilots pressed their attacks with determination bordering on desperation, understanding that American bomber production would only increase, and that stopping the daylight offensive required inflicting unsustainable losses on the attacking forces. Frontal attacks continued despite the Chin turret, with experienced German pilots accepting higher risk to achieve kills, while other fighters attacked from beam angles and from below, probing for weaknesses in the defensive coverage. The mission resulted in 60 B-17s lost to fighter attack and flak, with another 17 damaged beyond repair, 60 more damaged significantly, and over 600 aircrew killed, wounded, or missing. The loss rate of approximately 26% proved unsustainable for continued deep penetration missions without fighter escort, forcing a temporary pause in daylight operations against targets beyond escort range, while the 8th Air Force built up strength and developed longer-range escort fighters that could accompany bombers throughout their missions. But even in this defeat, the B-17G demonstrated its defensive superiority over earlier models. Analysis of loss rates by aircraft variant showed that G models suffered approximately 15 to 20% lower loss rates than F models on the same missions, a statistically significant difference attributed primarily to the improved frontal defensive armament that made head-on attacks more costly for German fighters. The Chin turret had achieved its design objective of reducing vulnerability to frontal attack, forcing German pilots to either accept higher losses from this attack profile or seek alternative approaches that exposed them to concentrated fire from other defensive positions. German pilots who survived attacks on B-17G formations described the experience in after-action reports and prisoner interrogations that Allied intelligence officers conducted with captured Luftwaffe aircrew. The accounts painted a consistent picture of overwhelming defensive firepower that made attacking the bomber formations psychologically devastating, even when actual hit probability remained relatively low. Oberleutnant Heinrich Sturm of Jagdgeschwader 3, captured after being shot down near Bremen in November 1943, told his interrogators that approaching a combat box of B-17s felt like flying into a wall of steel, with tracers seeming to fill every cubic meter of airspace around the formation. He described how the sight of hundreds of tracers converging from multiple bombers created an almost hypnotic effect that made maintaining focus on the target extremely difficult, with many pilots in his staffel breaking off attacks prematurely because they couldn't force themselves to continue into what appeared to be certain death. The psychological warfare aspect of the defensive firepower, particularly the heavy use of tracer ammunition that created visible streams of fire, proved nearly as effective as the actual bullets in deterring attacks and disrupting German fighter tactics. Major Gunther Rahl, a highly decorated fighter ace with over 270 victories primarily on the Eastern Front, who briefly served in the West during late 1943, later wrote in his memoirs that facing American heavy bomber formations represented a completely different type of aerial combat than fighting Soviet aircraft. Soviet bombers carried relatively light defensive armament and flew in loose formations that allowed German fighters to attack individually with minimal risk from defensive fire. American bombers, by contrast, flew in tight formations with interlocking defensive fire that forced German fighters to either accept significant losses or abandon attacks, neither option being acceptable when the strategic situation demanded that the daylight bombing offensive be stopped at any cost. The captured B-17G at Rechlin received intensive examination from teams of engineers and weapons specialists who sought to understand every aspect of the improved defensive system. They measured gun positions and fields of fire with precision instruments, creating detailed diagrams that showed coverage zones and blind spots. They tested the computing gun sights that helped gunners calculate lead angles for deflection shooting, marveling at the sophisticated electromechanical technology that gave American gunners significant advantages over German gunners, using simpler reflector sights that required manual lead estimation. They examined the ammunition feed systems that allowed reliable feeding from any attitude, preventing jams that plagued some German defensive weapons when aircraft maneuvered violently. They studied the intercom system that allowed gunners to coordinate their fire and warn each other of approaching threats, providing situational awareness that isolated German gunners lacked. Every examination revealed another aspect of American technical sophistication and manufacturing quality that explained why the B-17 had earned such a formidable reputation among Luftwaffe fighter pilots who faced them in combat. The turbo-supercharger installation that allowed the Wright Cyclone R-1820 engines to maintain full power at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet particularly impressed German engineers who struggled with high-altitude engine performance. The BMW 801 radial engine that powered the Focke-Wulf FW-190 lost significant power above 20,000 feet, limiting German fighter effectiveness at the altitudes where B-17s preferred to operate. The Daimler-Benz 605 inline engine in the Messerschmitt Bf 109 performed better at altitude, but still couldn't match American engines with their sophisticated supercharging systems that German industry couldn't replicate in production quantities. Hans-Werner Lerche flew the captured B-17G extensively during late 1943 and early 1944, accumulating dozens of hours in the aircraft and writing detailed reports on its handling characteristics, performance capabilities, and operational features. His professional assessment, stripped of propaganda and ideology, concluded that the B-17G represented the most capable defensive bomber in service with any air force, combining rugged construction, sophisticated defensive armament, and operational flexibility that made it ideally suited for its mission of daylight strategic bombing deep into enemy territory. But Lerche's reports also contained a more disturbing conclusion for German military planners who understood industrial mathematics. The B-17G, complex as it was with 13 guns, sophisticated turrets, computing gun sights, and advanced systems throughout, was being produced at rates that seemed impossible, yet were confirmed through multiple intelligence sources. Boeing's Seattle plant alone was building approximately 362 B-17s per month by late 1943, more than 12 per day from a single manufacturing facility. Add production from Douglas plants in Long Beach and Vega facilities in Burbank, and monthly B-17 production exceeded 500 aircraft, each one fully equipped with 13 guns and adequate ammunition for combat operations. German four-engine bomber production never approached these figures, despite having a more advanced aviation industry at the war's start. The Heinkel He 177, Germany's only operational four-engine heavy bomber, suffered from chronic problems that limited production and operational availability. Total production across all variants barely exceeded 1,100 aircraft between 1942 and 1944, and operational availability remained so poor that many units refused to accept the type. Germany simply couldn't match American heavy bomber production in either quantity or quality, a failure rooted in strategic decisions made in the 1930s, when German military doctrine emphasized medium bombers and dive bombers for tactical support rather than heavy bombers for strategic operations. The implications became inescapable to German officers who studied the captured B-17G and understood what it represented. American industrial capacity allowed equipping bombers with defensive armament that would bankrupt German resources if attempted on the same scale. Every B-17G carried 13 Browning M2 machine guns, weapons that were themselves products of sophisticated manufacturing requiring precision machining and quality control. American factories produced these guns by the tens of thousands, maintaining quality standards that ensured reliable operation under extreme conditions of altitude, temperature, and sustained firing. The ammunition expenditure proved equally staggering. Each B-17G carried approximately 11,000 rounds for its 13 guns, and the 8th Air Force was flying hundreds of bomber sorties daily by late 1943. Simple arithmetic showed that American bombers were firing millions of rounds weekly in defensive engagements over Europe, millions of rounds that had to be manufactured, shipped across the Atlantic, distributed to air bases across England, loaded aboard aircraft, and replaced after each mission. The logistical infrastructure supporting this ammunition expenditure dwarfed anything Germany could achieve with its limited industrial capacity and disrupted supply chains. Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri had reached production capacity of 1.6 billion rounds annually by 1943, a single facility outproducing Germany's entire small arms ammunition industry across all calibers. The plant operated continuously with 20,000 workers in shifts, maintaining quality control that rejected a round varying more than 0.001 inches from specifications, tolerances that German factories struggling with material shortages and forced labor couldn't maintain. This attention to quality ensured that American gunners rarely experienced weapon malfunctions due to ammunition defects, while German gunners increasingly faced jams and misfires as ammunition quality declined through 1944 and into 1945. December 1943 brought the first long-range escort missions that would fundamentally change the strategic bombing campaign's dynamics. P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks began accompanying bomber formations deeper into Germany, their presence forcing German fighters to either fight through the escorts to reach the bombers or abandon attacks entirely. The combination of heavily defended bomber formations protected by long-range fighters with superior performance created a situation where German fighter losses became unsustainable, regardless of how many bombers they managed to destroy. The defensive firepower of the B-17G formations, already formidable when bombers fought alone, became overwhelming when combined with escort fighters that could engage German attackers before they reached firing position on the bombers. German fighter pilots found themselves forced to fight a two-front battle, defending against escort fighters while simultaneously trying to penetrate bomber defensive fire, a tactical problem with no satisfactory solution given the numerical and material disadvantages they faced. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces with 104 confirmed victories and eventual commander of German fighter forces, understood the mathematics of attrition warfare and recognized that Germany was losing the battle of production. In meetings with Hermann Göring and other senior Nazi leadership during late 1943, early 1944, Galland repeatedly emphasized that German fighter production needed to increase dramatically to replace losses and build up strength for defensive operations. But even when production increased through Albert Speer's rationalization of German industry, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Germany could not simultaneously fight a multi-front war, maintain occupation forces across Europe, continue offensive operations on the Eastern Front, defend against Allied bombing, and match American aircraft production. The resources simply didn't exist, and attempting to do so only accelerated resource exhaustion and industrial collapse. Every factory worker conscripted for military service meant one less person producing weapons and ammunition. Every ton of steel allocated to U-boats or tanks meant less available for aircraft production. Every liter of fuel burned in training meant less available for combat operations. The B-17G, with its 1350 caliber machine guns, represented not just tactical capability, but strategic reality. America possessed industrial capacity that Germany could never match through any realistic means, and that industrial superiority was being translated directly into military capability that overwhelmed German defenses through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The defensive guns were merely the visible manifestation of American industrial might, symbols of a production system that could afford to put half a ton of machine guns plus thousands of rounds of ammunition on every bomber it produced, while simultaneously building thousands of fighters, tanks, ships, and all the other equipment needed to fight a global war across multiple continents and oceans. By spring 1944, the introduction of the P-51 Mustang in large numbers with drop tanks, allowing escort all the way to Berlin and back, eliminated the sanctuary that German fighters had previously enjoyed in the depths of German airspace. American bombers now flew protected throughout their missions. The combination of B-17 defensive firepower and Mustang escorts, creating a protective envelope that German fighters could penetrate only at prohibitive cost. Loss rates among Luftwaffe day fighter pilots climbed to 50% monthly casualties by mid-1944, unsustainable attrition that destroyed unit cohesion and forced Germany onto the defensive across all fronts. The average life expectancy for a German day fighter pilot by summer 1944 measured in weeks rather than months, with many pilots never achieving 10 combat missions before being killed, wounded too severely to continue flying, or captured after being shot down over Allied-controlled territory. The experience level across Luftwaffe fighter units declined precipitously, as veteran pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced with equally skilled aviators, creating a downward spiral where declining average skill levels led to higher loss rates, which further reduced average experience levels throughout the force. American pilot rotation policies, by contrast, sent crews home after completing tour requirements of 35 missions, later increased to 50, as loss rates declined with improved fighter escort. Survivors returned to training commands in the United States, where they passed hard-won combat experience to new crews, creating institutional learning that preserved lessons purchased with blood and ensured that each new generation of bomber crews arrived in England better prepared than the last. This systematic approach to crew utilization reflected American industrial thinking applied to human resources, recognizing that experienced personnel were valuable assets that should be preserved and used to multiply effectiveness across the entire force, rather than consumed in combat until death or incapacitation removed them from service. Germany couldn't afford such systematic rotation, because it lacked the industrial capacity to produce enough aircraft to maintain operational strength while simultaneously rotating experienced crews to training duties. Every pilot capable of flying combat missions stayed on the line until killed, captured, or physically unable to continue, leading to the declining experience levels that made German fighter forces progressively less effective, even when aircraft production increased in absolute terms during 1944. The story of the B-17G's defensive firepower was fundamentally a story about American industrial capacity and organizational efficiency, translated into military capability, that overwhelmed German defenses through sustained material superiority. The 13 guns weren't just weapons. They were messages about production capabilities that Nazi Germany could never match. Every burst from those guns demonstrated industrial depth and logistical excellence that supported sustained operations at intensity levels German industry couldn't maintain. Every bomber that returned to England, despite heavy battle damage, holes in wings and fuselage from cannon shells and machine gun bullets, testified to manufacturing quality and design sophistication that produced aircraft capable of absorbing tremendous punishment and continuing to fight. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.